Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. So we'll pick up here talking a little bit more about the Cold War and how it unfolded. We'll go back in the next. I'm still trying to loosely follow the book's lesson plan a little bit, even though I'm improvising on some stuff. But we'll go back and cover kind of domestic politics and what was going on in the home front and how all these presidential elections went and all that at the beginning of next week. But for right now, we'll kind of keep following the trail of kind of where the Cold War leads us for a little while. And so, obviously, the Cold War starts during the Truman administration. 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower replaces Harry Truman in office, and he continues the Korean War for a short period of time. But in 1953, ultimately in 53, the war is going to come to completion. So, Eisenhower and his immediate successor, John F. Kennedy, are going to adopt a plan or adopt the phrase of peaceful coexistence to describe kind of their aims as far as policy with the Soviet Union, that is trying to avoid outright war. However, that's not to say that either one of them backs down as a Cold Warrior. In fact, both of them are very much committed to fighting the Cold War. Although, each of them might have done things slightly different than the other at different times, but for the most part, they were consistent on the idea that we need to oppose the communist system while making sure we don't all die in a nuclear holocaust. So wanting to strike a little bit of a balance of how to deal with a very real evil and a very real threat, while also not, creating a cure that was worse than the disease, in terms of starting some sort of armed conflict that could lead to nuclear annihilation. Because once the Soviets have access to the atomic bomb, again, game has changed. We're no longer competing from the same position of strength, even though, America may have more of them at a given time. It's still not a contest you want to get in. And, of course, this is becoming a more and more scary thing, too, as, in World War II, we had to kind of fly over the target and drop it. But as you were coming into the late 50s and early 60s, now we've developed missile technology where you can put a nuclear warhead on a missile, fire it hundreds of miles away in the ocean, and it hit where you want. And so the improvement in missile technology and the invention of the nuclear missile, make it a scarier thing than even if, the old days where, you had to fly over and drop from the air. So hotspots keep kind of coming up, and the Cold War leaves no continent untouched. There's political things going on in Europe. There's political things going on in South America, oftentimes violent. There's political things and violence going on in Africa, going on in Asia. Australia, I guess, didn't have a whole lot of violence or anything, but they were still engaged in. They were a part of SEATO, and so there's no one that was completely out of the game, as far as being relevant to Cold War politics. Kind of consumes everything at some level. One hotspot that really shows up is in what used to be the French colony of Indochina, which had been then become the independent nations of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. And so that's a region. They had called it Indochina because the culture was a combination of Indian and Chinese elements, predominantly Buddhist culture, which is kind of where the Indian influence comes in, but with some Chinese influence as well. Ultimately, at the end of the war, France is going to want to hang on to their colonial holdings, but they're not going to be able to. They took too much damage from World War II. And in particular, in the region that is now Vietnam, they faced opposition from a group led by a Vietnamese nationalist by the name of Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh started a group known as the Viet Minh, and they were fighting for Vietnamese independence from the French. And in particular, the Vietnamese actually defeat the French in a battle known as the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And this kind of makes Ho Chi Minh into something of a national hero inside of Vietnam. And you can say Vietnam, Vietnam. It's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But problem is, Ho Chi Minh is increasingly starting to gravitate into the communist orbit. He's getting further and further into adopting a communistic belief system, and is becoming more and more closely aligned to the Soviet Union. And so, what happens to Vietnam when they go and sign the peace deals is kind of a familiar story, some parallels to what happens in Korea. That North Vietnam is basically given to Ho Chi Minh and his Communist Party, and then South Vietnam is given to a more pro-Western regime, not a purebred democracy, but freer, and it was led by a man by the name of No Dinh Diem. And the problem with No Dinh Diem had some political problems there in Vietnam. One of them was that he was a Catholic, and this is a 99% Buddhist country. The Catholicism had been the religion of France when they took the region over, and so to become a Catholic in Vietnam was essentially in the view of a lot of the Vietnamese Buddhists, was to accommodate the imperial power. It was to kind of betray the Vietnamese culture and adopt the French culture. And in fact, No Dinh Diem did have a lot of sympathy for elements of the French culture. And so protest against his government began to step up, and becomes a group of people sympathetic to the North, sympathetic to the communists, that start trying to overthrow the South Vietnamese government and bring it into unification with the North. And this South Vietnamese communist terror group was known as the Viet Cong, or the VC. And the North Vietnamese are fueling this movement as well, and supporting it. And at some point in the early 60s, at some point, the North Vietnamese make the play to begin to go take over South Vietnam. And this is the beginning of the long Vietnam War. Our involvement in it was about a 7 or 8 year period, but the war itself lasted longer than that. So the North invades the South. We don't immediately go to war. That's gonna wait. We'll learn about how we get deeply involved next week. But we do start to get involved at a cursory level in the beginning. In particular, we did a lot of sending special forces and people like that over to South Vietnam to try to train and equip the South Vietnamese army. Now, one of the frustrations of anyone who was involved in Vietnam was the fact that we do all these things to try to train and equip and build up the South Vietnamese army, and it never seemed to really get very far. They made a little bit of progress, but not much. I think there were a few troops on the ground when Eisenhower was president, but when John F. Kennedy becomes president in 1960, we're going to step up the presence of American advisors and stuff of that. And the Vietnam War, as we conceive of it, really begins under President Lyndon B. Johnson with the whole Gulf of Tonkin incident. That's for next week. But you do start to have some activity in Vietnam during the 60s. One thing in particular that winds up being kind of an ironic turn of events, as we'll see, the CIA, which is actually kind of new on the block. Your book kind of glossed over the CIA getting started. So the CIA evolves out of the OSS, or Office of Strategic Services, which was the military-connected intelligence agency. Truman is the guy that comes up with the idea of starting the CIA proper. So the Central Intelligence Agency is the agency charged with conducting foreign intelligence and surveillance on account of the United States overseas. Legally not supposed to operate in the United States. If you follow the history of the CIA, they have disregarded that on numerous occasions. Nonetheless, they become a very, very important agency during the peak of Soviet espionage and counter-espionage, which we'll talk about a little bit more next week. So, Vietnam is turning into a mess. People are protesting the No Din Din government. Say that 7 times fast. And what happens, the peak of the protests there in South Vietnam happens when a Buddhist monk literally, not figuratively, literally lights himself on fire in a suicidal display of opposition to the regime. Like literally douses himself in gasoline, lights a match, and burns himself alive in public on TV in order to protest Dim's government. And at this point in time, there's beginning to be this sense that we're going to lose South Vietnam to the communists if we don't get another leader in South Vietnam. And at this point, a lot of our American policy toward Vietnam is guided by the idea that is known as the domino theory, which was the thought that if one domino begins to fall in Southwest Asia, or in Southeast Asia, excuse me, that if one of those countries begins to fall to communism, the others are going to go down like a row of dominoes, which is kind of a sort of a big assumption, but it kind of turned out to be true because, ultimately, fast forward to 1975, we're going to lose the Vietnam War. Ultimately, and when we do, it's not going to be long after Vietnam goes communist, and so is Cambodia and Laos, the surrounding countries. So there's a little bit of truth to the domino theory, although you might also argue that losing one didn't necessitate the others per se. Now, and it should be said that this communist government that takes over in Cambodia, which becomes known as the Khmer Rouge, is one of the worst regimes of the 20th century, which is saying something because, as we've looked at, lots of bad regimes in the 20th century between Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Pol Pot, Idi Amin. Pol Pot is the Cambodian guy. Saddam Hussein. There's lots of bad guys in the 20th century. So the CIA goes to JFK. And they say, President Kennedy, we don't think we can, we need someone out. And we think that we can overthrow the government of No Din Din. And this is not the first time that the CIA gets itself involved in overthrowing a foreign government. In fact, it happened twice under President Eisenhower. One was in Iran, where Iranian elections had brought a very a socialist-leaning prime minister by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh to power. We were scared that Mossadegh was going to move Iran into the Soviet orbit, which was important because they had a lot of oil. And, Iran still had a Shah running the show, but Mossadegh was emerging as a challenger to the power. And the CIA actually, conducted an overseas coup and overthrew the Iranian leadership of Mossadegh. And a lot of Iranians are still angry about this today. And it's one of many reasons why our relationship with the Iranians isn't good. And I'm not saying they were wrong to do it. I mean, because the guy, you didn't want him to go Soviet. There's that. And then there also was a coup against a communist leader who was coming to power in Guatemala, just a little bit south of Mexico. We were scared to have a communist country that close to us, and so we were involved in a coup there as well. So the CIA had kind of become an old hat at overthrowing governments in its short period of time. And so the CIA kind of helped organize, worked with some local and some people that they were working with to oversee a coup to see No Din Dim overthrown. The assumption was that Dim would then kind of, go to either Paris or to the United States as a refugee. Well, the whole process goes wrong, and Dim winds up getting shot to death. And they said that John F. Kennedy, when he received the word that Dim was killed, and he realized that he had given the CIA the go-ahead to go through with this mission, and that he had single-handedly caused the assassination of No Din Dim, they said he became so upset he ran for the toilet and vomited violently, because he realized that death was on his head. And that turned out to be a very ironic turn of events, obviously. So this is kind of going to so all this is going on in Vietnam, and we'll return to the Vietnam story, in a little bit. But just know that this is starting to heat up as we turn our attention to the biggest hot spot of all for us, which was Cuba. So Cuba, if you recall, during the 1800s, many Americans had kind of coveted Cuba, wanted to. It to become either a colony or maybe even a state at some point. There was some discussion of it. Spanish-American War, we wound up gaining temporary control of Cuba from the Spanish and then giving them independence, but giving them independence on terms that enabled that were very friendly to American interests. So there was a lot of American investment in Cuba. Havana, the capital city of Cuba, is a gorgeous country, physically speaking, and so the Havana, the capital of Cuba, kind of became the Las Vegas of the time period. That's where rich people would go to gamble and stuff like that, and kind of they kind of had a wild nightlife and so on. And so it was kind of a haunt for the people that are in for that sort of thing. But also, there's a lot of American companies had factories. A lot of them had plantations of certain tropical crops. So there was a lot of American investment tied up in Cuba. Now, Cuba had fallen into the hands of a dictator by the name of Fulgencio Batista. And Batista was not a great guy. He started to persecute a lot of political dissidents, throw some people in jail, that sort of a thing. And so a rebellion started to coalesce against Batista. And we kind of had a little bit of a wait and see attitude because, Batista was someone we could do business with, but we also knew that he was kind of a bad guy as well. Well, the guy that emerges as the leadership of this Cuban rebellion is a guy you may have heard of by the name of Fidel Castro. And Castro was working in tandem with an Argentinian Marxist rebel by the name of Che Guevara, who you may have seen on an Idiot College Kids t-shirt at some point in history. And somehow he managed to become a folk hero. He's a murderer of many and, spreader of communism and doom. But somehow it became cool to wear Che t-shirts and wear posters among lefty kids. Kind of makes me want to slap a hippie, to be honest. So anyway, so Castro, though, is the leader of the whole thing, and he is able to successfully overthrow the Batista regime. And this happens, I want to say, it was 61 or so, well, it was a little earlier, 59. So, and there's a brief period of time, and so Castro had a beard that looked about like this. And kind of had this man of the people image. He was a very charismatic figure. He won the sympathy of a lot of the poor classes in Cuba. And the revolution, until he was in power, was not very explicitly ideological. It was very much just about getting Batista out of there. And then when he comes to power, we don't really know which direction he's going to go. We're kind of trying to court him. The Soviets are trying to court him. Well, it turns out that his instinct was much more a Marxist and communistic instinct. And so he winds up and some people really do think that we made a couple diplomatic snafus here or there, that maybe things could have been different. I think Castro's heart, you just watching the fruit of the rest of his life, I think he clearly, was always going to be a dictator. But so Castro winds up joining Team Soviet Union. And so he does, Cuba's not like a puppet state like East Germany was, where they're pulling the strings, but he is very much in the Soviets' pocket, and the Soviets really buy Castro's loyalty. And we're already disturbed about this, and then he does something really disturbing to American interest, which is he actually seizes and nationalizes all the American investment, all the private. So all these American companies had built factories, farms over in Cuba. He took all of that land and all of that property for the government. And so you had a lot of really powerful and connected people who had lost a lot of investment. And so they're going to, the president, like, y'all got to fix this. This is not a good deal. Originally Eisenhower, and then Kennedy's going to come in, and he's going to be elected in 1960, take office in early 61. So the revolution happens in 59. So 2 years dealing with Eisenhower, and then all the time with Kennedy. Both Eisenhower and Kennedy, who incidentally are both being advised by two very powerful brothers, the Dulles brothers, who managed the Secretary of State position and the CIA director position, respectively. They're really leaning on first Eisenhower and then Kennedy, saying, you got to take care of this guy. This is a problem. Because remember, Cuba is 90 miles from Florida. So if you could make a road over the ocean, then the drive from Miami Beach to Florida would be about like driving from Saluda to Greenville. That's a problem. You could get there in a couple of hours if you could drive over the ocean. So to have a communist country that close, that's allied with the Soviet Union, this was a big deal. And then also you do have a decent amount of Cuban exile. There's a decent Cuban population in Florida, more so after the revolution, because a lot of people that would oppose the revolution fled. Often for the lives, because Castro's going to start, like all these communist guys, he's going to start persecuting religion, he's going to start persecuting political dissenters, he's going to start throwing people in jail. And Castro coming to power is bad news. A little story about Fidel Castro. Castro kept this real man of the people image, where he really wanted to look like he was just this, man from the bush who, just galvanized the spirit of the Cuban people and, led them to victory over the imperialist dog Batista or whatever. So, but the reality is he wanted to live the high life, and so he had to do it in secret. So, to a certain extent. So, he had this. This is according to a man who was his bodyguard for years. He wrote a memoir in the last couple of years, and he said that Castro had a secret island that he vacationed on that no one else knew about to keep his image. And he said that he, for over the course of 30 years, he only invited 7-8 people ever to come there. And it had a fully staffed hospital, and they kept someone with his blood type prisoner there just in case he ever needed a blood transfusion. And they said that Castro, his palate, they had 4 milk cows, one for each member of Castro's immediate family. And each of them had a cow that was specifically calibrated, that was specifically chosen in order to match their specific palate preferences for milk. And they said that Castro's ability to, his palate for milk was so developed that if you brought him milk from the wrong cow, he would immediately recognize it and go on a tirade and throw you out the room. It's a weird world to be a dictator. I can't imagine what that does to your head if you never have to ask anyone for anything. You just tell them what to do at risk of their life. It's a weird job. So Castro comes to power, and we start doing anything we can to come against him. Ultimately, as Kennedy becomes president, he is going to sign off on a plan. Actually, let me take that back. Eisenhower's administration really kind of got the ball rolling on this plan. But then when Kennedy becomes president, he is presented with the question of whether to go through with it or not, and he decides to do it. And the plan was to fuel a kind of counter-revolutionary force that was, led by some exiles who escaped Cuba that were living in Miami. And the idea was to secretly, help train them, supply them, and then when they went and invaded Cuba, they were going to invade Cuba and retake it from the Castro regime, and we didn't want to commit troops because we were afraid that we would bring the Soviets into a war if we did that, but we were going to provide them secret air cover, U.S. airplanes kind of unmarked or whatever. We were going to provide them air cover while keeping what we called plausible deniability, and a bunch of other logistical support to these Cuban fighters. And so the invasion was to take place at off of a beachhead in Cuba that, when you translate it out to English, it means Bay of Pigs. Well, problem is, the day or two before the invasion, supposedly the exiles were not really good about keeping their lips zipped as it related to some of the confidential stuff. Word starts to spread around, and in particular, Kennedy's, hearing that the halls of the UN are abuzz with rumors that America is involved in this plot. The Adlai Stevenson, the former Democratic presidential nominee 2 times, who had by then become Kennedy's UN ambassador, he is put in this really awkward position where he's having to go to the UN and deny that we're doing anything, even though we kind of were. And so what happens is Kennedy starts to see the political downsides to this, that, if something goes wrong and the Russians blame it for us, there's a potential threat of war there. So Kennedy decides at the last minute to nix the air power. They said, we'll still let them use our boats to cross over or whatever, but we're going to back off of, sending in the planes. Here's the problem. The entire Cuban invasion plan was built around the idea of the United States Air Force providing not just air superiority, but absolute air supremacy. The whole plan was built on the fact that we do not have to worry about a bird in the air for us in support of Castro. So the invasion falls to pieces. It's a humiliation. They all get captured. Most of them are killed. Those that are not are imprisoned for extended periods of time. Very few people survive back or anything, if any. I don't even know. Absolute disaster. Everyone finds out about it. We're not able to stay secret. We got the worst of both worlds. The mission failed because Kennedy backed out at the last second in just a loss of will. He generally was a pretty good president, but he really fouled that one up. But then we also didn't really keep the plausible deniability and secrecy. It was front page news. Everyone knew what happened. So now we've embarrassed ourselves, ramped up tensions with the Soviets for nothing, and it nearly cost us the world, as we'll talk about in just a minute. So we ratcheted up the tensions with the Soviets, but we didn't actually get Castro overthrown. Well, then there's going to be an extended period of time, actually, where the CIA becomes obsessed with assassinating Fidel Castro. And Kennedy, and both President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, gave them the thumbs up. Go after him. And so there was a extended mission to kill Castro that was referred to as Operation Mongoose. And Operation Mongoose hatched plan after plan after plan of how to take Castro out. And some of them were flagrantly bizarre. One of them involved setting a landmine under a seashell at his favorite beach that he relaxed at, as though he's going to happen to step on just the right seashell to trigger this bomb. Just weird things. The weirdest one of all to me was they thought Because they believe that in the Cuban culture, having a beard was a sign of machismo or manhood, and so they thought that perhaps it would be a humiliation to Castro and a public relations nightmare if his beard, which was impressive, although he's a horrible human being who murdered millions of innocents, or at least hundreds of thousands of them. You know, they really thought that it would be a humiliation and a public PR nightmare if his beard fell out. So they tried to poison him with a poison that would make his hair fall out. And I'm like, wait a second. You've been trying to assassinate him, coming up with insane plan after insane plan to assassinate the man. You get close enough to give him poison, and you give him the kind of poison that would make his beard fall out, not the kind that would kill him. What sense does that make? It's completely bizarre. So the CIA tries to kill Castro, is never able to do it. One of the major failures of the organization's history, because the old law: if you first don't succeed, try again. Well, they tried again, and for whatever reason, they were just never able to kill the guy. So, but in the meantime, Castro obviously is starting to feel quite threatened by this, and so he turns to his buddies over in Russia. And by now, Stalin has died. Stalin dies, I believe it was 1953, of a cerebral hemorrhage. There's questions about whether he was murdered. Some people think he was poisoned. There's some rumors that he was poisoned because people thought that he might be about to lead Russia into a war, some other things. Some people thought he might be poisoned just because people had it with the way he was running things. There was, in the couple years leading up to his death, he was ill, and he was actually vacationing a lot more than he usually had, and just, a bunch of things like that. But supposedly, like, one of his doctors came to him and actually suggested that for the sake of his health and everything, all the stress he was under, that perhaps he should retire. And Stalin responded by having the man thrown into a gulag for suggesting that he quit. So that's kind of just the way he ran things in Russia. If you're interested in hearing a little bit more about kind of what Stalin was like at the height of his, terroristic powers, I posted a video for the world history class called Stalinist Russia that I think you might be interested in, if you're into this kind of stuff. So, Stalin, whether it was natural or not, because he had been declining for a couple of years, or whether he was murdered, either way, it was over. The Soviets, the real successor that ultimately emerges within not too long after Stalin's death is a fellow by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev was famous for making a very daring and controversial speech at a meeting of the Communist Party where he criticized, quote-unquote, the cult of personality, which was basically the worshipful attitude towards Stalin that had developed where people were unable to kind of question. Because the way Stalin ran things was like, if he was in favor of a certain policy on Monday, then if you said, no, I'm in favor, let's say he favors policy X on Monday, and then you say, excuse me, I'm in favor of policy Y. To the gulag you go. The next day, Stalin has slept on it, he's changed his mind, he decides, you know what, I'm in favor of policy Y, and he says, I favor policy Y, and someone says, well, I thought we agreed yesterday on policy X. He's off to the gulag with you, because, because he cared more about you agreeing with him as a man than what the actual position was. He didn't want independent thought, he didn't want anyone questioning him. And he was extraordinarily paranoid. Remember, on his way to consolidating power in Russia, he killed, hundreds, if not thousands, of Communist Party members who had helped him in the revolution and all this stuff. When he was serving in the Revolutionary Army alongside Trotsky and Lenin and all these guys. So, so that's who Stalin was. So Khrushchev is kind of replaces him, and the sense is that Khrushchev he lets the full weight of Soviet state oppression lifts just a little bit on some domestic things for a short period of time. Then things like the Hungarian revolt are going to bring the hammer back down, and he's going to show his true colors as being just another one of these, terrible communist leaders. But for a period of time, it looks like the Soviets might actually kind of, at least marginally improve. They're going to try to keep it from becoming as much of a one-man show, and that was accomplished. The Communist Party kind of governs by committee a little bit more than they did under Stalin from this point out. But anyway, Khrushchev is the guy in charge at this point, and Khrushchev actually sends nuclear weapons to Cuba, nuclear warheads, to have as a secret weapon there against the United States should something go down. And this is not long after the United States had put intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, in Turkey, which were actually within firing range, where they could fire a warhead into Russian soil. So Khrushchev had been hunting for an opportunity to get close enough to retaliate with that. When Cuba's going through all this assassination business, Khrushchev leans in on this opportunity, and they decide they're going to put these missiles in Cuba. So now we literally have nuclear weapons 90 miles off the coast of Florida, as far away as here from Saluda to Greenville. That's how close the nukes are to Miami Beach. Well, this won't do. And we discover we have a type of spy plane called the U-2 that there actually had been a big incident when we first came out with this spy plane. One of them fell in Russian airspace, which was, of course, proof that we were spying on them, which they should have known anyway. But this was a big public relations thing and another low point in our relationship, the first U-2 incident. But another one of these U-2 planes is flying over Cuba, and we find proof. We see the missile silos. We see the warheads. We know what's going on. And it plunges us into a 2-week period of turmoil unlike anything in American history, known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because for 2 weeks, we are walking a tightrope, and one misstep leads to thermonuclear World War III. I should add, too, that by the time this is going down in 1961 or 2, by this point in time, let me double check the exact year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah, October 1962. By now, we're not dealing with we're not dealing with the atomic bomb anymore. We're dealing with the hydrogen bomb as being a part of the arsenal of the world. So the atomic bomb, as bad as it was, that was dropped on Japan, functioned off of nuclear fission. Maybe I might be getting dyslexic, but one focused on fission, one on fusion. The hydrogen bomb was exponentially more powerful than the atomic bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's the kind of technology that is in play now. Not that they had a hydrogen bomb in Cuba. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying that's the state of nuclear tech by 1962. So the stakes are even higher than they would have been in 1950. So you've got these missiles with intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads located 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So we get into some extraordinarily tense negotiations. Kennedy and Khrushchev are going back and forth on some of the most high-stakes phone calls of all time. We're trying to figure out what we're going to do. Do we respond militarily? Because if there's ever been an act of war, pointing those rockets at us certainly would count. But if we go to war in the age of the hydrogen bomb with the Soviet Union in 1962, that's a bad scenario as well. So what are we supposed to do in this case? The decision that Kennedy makes is to blockade Cuba. So we send Navy ships around the perimeter of the island, saying that no Russian vessel or no other vessel is going to be allowed to come into Cuba, because they were going to be bringing more missiles to Cuba, reinforcements. And the order was given that if anyone crossed the blockade line, fire. And if one of those ships fires, World War III is on. And they came, I'm telling you, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a game of thermonuclear chicken. They came as close as it could come. I mean, literally, like you had a ship that was like in direct range of crossing the line. The people on the American ship are literally discussing to fire or not. They're trying to judge if the distance is close enough, like to go ahead and pull the trigger. And I mean, at the last second, the Soviet ships start to turn around. So we very, very, very nearly have nuclear war. The way that we solved everything, we agreed to a compromise. We would take our missiles out of Turkey. They would take their missiles out of Cuba. We actually kept, the fact that we took the missiles out of Turkey was actually kept secret until the 1990s. Everyone thought in the 1960s Kennedy just, gave away nothing and just convinced the Russians to give up. But we made a pretty big concession there. But we both did, and I think it was, so, Kennedy's mistakes and his kind of weakness and waffling in his personality really caused the Bay of Pigs failure, which leads us to the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the other hand, once he was in the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, JFK came through like a champ in that situation because, I mean, he's literally, I mean, you're walking a tightrope like you can't even begin to imagine. And one false word to the wrong Soviet ambassador, might be the end of the road for civilization. Ultimately, it's this really tense face-off. I mean, basically, Khrushchev and Kennedy, play chicken with the world. Khrushchev blinks, but manages to get Kennedy to give him some concessions as well. And so, October 62, we successfully navigate the Cuban Missile Crisis, the scariest 2 weeks in American history, and the closest that the Cold War ever comes to becoming a for-real war. Why was there never a Soviet-American war? I think really it's just the sense of there was such a priority on finding peaceful solution to things because we knew how devastating a war with the Soviet Union would be. First off, there's so many of them. I mean, we saw in World War I and II how the Russian and Soviet governments, were willing just to sacrifice massive amounts of soldiers. They had, their technology was not as good as ours, but it was, in the ballpark. They were at least industrialized. Our stuff was better. Our military equipment was better, but they were a leadership class in the Soviet Union. Didn't have a whole lot of conscience. You've got thermonuclear stakes at this point in time, and things could have gone really, really bad. And so, everyone was really, on both sides, really wanted to come to peaceful solutions whenever possible. And this is actually called the mutually assured destruction theory, or MAD theory. That is, the presence of nuclear weapons actually acted as a deterrence against anyone actually using them because of the consequences would be so devastating. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's like a little bit of a thaw in the Cold War. There's still a gap between when the Cuban Missile Crisis happens and when we go into the period in the 70s that is known as détente, which is where the Cold War really kind of starts to thaw a little bit. Things are still going to be pretty close to hot war, but this is the closest we ever came to hot war. This is the closest we ever come to having the Soviet-American War, which would have involved all the nations of the earth at that particular point in time. So it really would have been World War III. Some of the losers in this are the Cuban people. We're never able to remove Castro. And even when Fidel Castro finally died, I mean, he lived forever. When he does finally die in the late 2000s, he's succeeded by his brother Raul Castro, who's still in charge. And they're still a very oppressive government that has a pretty total control over everybody and doesn't allow a whole lot of freedom. Cuban people still live in a lot of poverty. We respond to all this. We actually put an economic embargo on Cuba, so it's actually, with very few exceptions, it's illegal to trade with the Cubans. Actually, what's interesting is if you were able to go to Cuba, if you get if you can find the excuse to finagle a visa to go there and check it out, you'll see that the streets are littered with like vintage cars from the 50s and 60s. because they weren't able to get any new American cars. So that's what they had, is just keep refitting these old, these old classic muscle cars from the 50s. And now they also got some cheap-made Soviet cars in the 70s, 80s, or whatever. But, they say that if the embargo ever drops and we ever have free trade with Cuba, that probably it's going to have a huge impact on the price for like classic cars and stuff, because it'll kind of flood the market with stuff that's like really rare here. Anyway, Kennedy does have installed in the White House after the Cuban Missile Crisis, to facilitate any future crisis management like this, they install a red telephone inside the White House that is a direct line to the Kremlin, which is the Soviet version of the White House, so that at any given time, President Kennedy or his successors, because this stayed in the White House until the fall of the USSR in 1991, any given time he could pick up that red phone and get the Soviet premier on the line, direct line to the Soviet leadership. And so Cuban Missile Crisis does lead to that particular breakthrough in diplomatic relations. But your parents and grandparents and mine came really close to getting annihilated. Came really, really close to getting incinerated by atomic bombs in 1962. And so it's a good thing. It's a good thing that we dodged that bullet by the grace of Almighty God. So anyway, we'll have some more for you next week, and we'll kind of take a look at what the domestic politics look like in America during this time period. All right, take care.